The air in the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite was a precise, sterile hum, a constant whisper of filtration systems and calibrated machinery. It was always like this, cool, dry, devoid of anything that might compromise the integrity of the evidence laid out under the unforgiving glare of the overhead halogens. I preferred it. Every molecule felt accounted for, every shadow banished. It was a place for clarity, for truth, no matter how ugly. I leaned closer to the examination table, my breath shallow against the filter mask. Before me lay a fragment of what was once a state-of-the-art bioengineering lab. Specifically, a section of Dr. Aris Thorne's workbench, or what remained of it. It was a mangled composite of scorched polymer, fused metal, and a fine, almost crystalline dust that shimmered faintly under the light. The initial reports were unequivocal: catastrophic lab accident. A volatile reaction, a containment breach, a brilliant mind consumed by the very forces he sought to master. Suicide by science. I ran a gloved finger along a jagged edge of the fused polymer, careful not to disturb the delicate dust. The smell, even through the mask, was a ghost of what it must have been at the scene, an acrid cocktail of burnt synthetics, ozone, and something else, something vaguely organic yet utterly alien. The first responders, the fire marshals, the local investigators, they'd all walked through the devastation, cataloging the widespread destruction, the sheer force that had ripped through Thorne's high-security facility. They saw a picture of an uncontrolled event, an explosion that left little but ruin and the grim remains of its architect. But widespread destruction rarely told the whole story. The truth, I'd learned, was usually in the quiet corners, the anomalies, the things that didn't quite fit the grand narrative. My eyes traced the patterns of charring on the composite, the way the heat had warped and melted the different materials. The force had been immense, certainly. Structural integrity compromised, equipment vaporized, safety protocols seemingly overridden in a flash of blinding light and concussive energy. I picked up a pair of tweezers, their tips gleaming under the light, and gently probed a small, intact section of what appeared to be a carbon fiber panel. It was about the size of my palm, torn from a larger structure, its edges ragged and sharp. Most of its surface was blackened, scorched by intense heat. But there, in a shallow depression, nestled against a slightly raised rivet, was something else. It wasn't a burn mark in the conventional sense, not like the widespread thermal damage that coated everything else. This was a pinpoint discoloration, a minute, almost imperceptible pit, no larger than a grain of sand. And within that pit, barely visible to the naked eye, was a faint, iridescent sheen. It caught the light, a tiny rainbow against the charcoal black. I adjusted the magnification on the stereo microscope and brought the fragment into focus. The pit deepened, revealing itself as a perfect, almost surgical depression. The iridescent sheen resolved into a microscopic, crystalline residue, clinging to the edges of the tiny crater. It was distinctly separate from the general dust that covered the rest of the panel, and its structure was unlike anything I'd encountered from an ordinary thermal decomposition or an uncontrolled chemical cascade. This wasn't a byproduct of the explosion. This was something applied. My internal monologue ratcheted up a notch. The official narrative of a tragic accident or a desperate suicide hinged on the idea that the entire event was a singular, uncontrolled release of energy. But this minuscule detail, suggested otherwise. It implied a localized, incredibly precise application of energy before or simultaneously with the main event, yet distinct from it. A focused, almost surgical incision into the material, followed by, or perhaps triggering, the larger catastrophe. I leaned back slightly, my gaze sweeping over the sterile environment of the suite, then returning to the carbon fiber fragment. The air, which had felt so neutral moments before, now carried a subtle weight. A new kind of tension. A colleague, the lead field agent from the initial scene, approached my station. His expression was a mix of exhaustion and professional satisfaction. "Still digging, Reed?" he asked, his voice muffled by his own mask. "It's an open and shut, unfortunate accident. Everything points to Thorne either making a fatal miscalculation or taking his own way out with a bang. The lab was a pressure cooker, his research, world-changing. The reports are clear." I didn't look up immediately. And chaos rarely leaves such perfectly structured anomalies. He paused, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "What are you seeing?" I gently tapped the carbon fiber fragment with the tweezers, indicating the pinpoint depression. "This," I stated, the word hanging in the precise, controlled air of the suite, "doesn't fit the profile of a random thermal event. This is too specific. Too clean. It looks less like an accident, and more like a fuse." My colleague frowned, leaning in closer, though he kept a respectful distance from my workspace. He couldn't see what I saw, not yet. He saw the widespread devastation, the obvious conclusion. The meticulous eye, they called it. Sometimes, it was a curse. It meant I saw the threads that didn't belong, the subtle deviations from the expected pattern. And this thread, this microscopic trace, was pulling me into a labyrinth far more intricate and perilous than a simple lab accident. Dr. Aris Thorne hadn't just died. He'd been murdered. And whoever had done it had been very, very good at cleaning up their tracks. Almost. Here, everything was clinical, precise, designed to strip away chaos and reveal truth. I stood over the stainless steel table, a halogen lamp humming softly above, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on what remained of Aris Thorne. His body, or what was left of it, told a story of immense kinetic force and extreme heat. The initial assessment had been swift and definitive, a catastrophic lab accident, probably a volatile chemical reaction gone awry. The external damage supported that conclusion: severe thermal burns across 90% of his body, extensive blunt force trauma, and fragmentation injuries consistent with an explosion. To the casual observer, or even a less seasoned investigator, the narrative was complete. Case closed. But I wasn't a casual observer. My eyes, trained over decades to sift through the debris of tragedy for the misplaced thread, the aberrant pattern, saw more. I donned a fresh pair of gloves, the latex snapping crisply against my wrists, and leaned closer. The senior forensic examiner, a quiet, meticulous woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, stood opposite me, her expression unreadable. She knew my reputation. She knew I looked beyond the obvious. "Initial findings confirm widespread blast trauma," she stated, her voice low and even, as she gestured with a gloved hand towards a section of Thorne's torso. "Internal organ damage consistent with overpressure. Thermal injuries indicate extreme temperatures." I nodded, my gaze fixed on a specific area of Thorne's left forearm, an area where the skin, though charred, seemed to have buckled in a peculiar way. "And the burn patterns?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Are they entirely uniform with the primary blast wave?" She paused. her brow furrowing almost imperceptibly. Mostly. But there are some anomalies. A few localized areas, particularly on the anterior aspects of the limbs, show a deeper, more focused charring than the surrounding tissue. Almost as if a secondary, more intense heat source was applied, or a different accelerant. A different accelerant. My internal alarm bells, already ringing faintly since the lab, intensified. An accident wouldn't differentiate its heat sources like that. I moved around the table, my eyes scanning, absorbing. The fragmentation injuries were also curious. While many were consistent with lab equipment shrapnel, a handful of smaller, denser metallic fragments were embedded in the deeper tissues, particularly around the chest cavity. They didn't appear to be from any standard lab glassware or equipment I'd seen in the wreckage. Any foreign material recovered from the wounds? I asked. The examiner consulted her digital tablet, swiping through images. A few microfragments. We're running mass spectrometry on them now. Preliminary analysis suggests a unique alloy, not common in typical laboratory settings. High nickel content, with traces of osmium. Osmium. That was interesting. A rare, hard, bluish-white transition metal. Not something you'd find lying around a bioengineering lab. My mind immediately started cataloging possibilities, however remote. I moved to Thorne's hands, examining the remains of his fingernails under a magnified lens. They were brittle, scorched, but beneath the char, a faint, almost imperceptible residue clung to the cuticle of his right index finger. It was microscopic, shimmering faintly, like dust motes caught in a sunbeam. "What is this?" I murmured, pointing it out to the examiner. She leaned in, adjusting the magnification. Her eyes widened slightly. "That's unusual. It appears to be crystalline. Non-biological. Definitely not from the lab environment." She carefully took a microsample with a specialized tool. "We'll analyze it immediately." I watched, a quiet satisfaction settling in my gut. This was it. The whisper. The trace. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make this look like an accident, but they hadn't been meticulous enough. Later that afternoon, back in my cramped office in the same facility, I reviewed the initial interview summaries. The first reports were thin, focused on the immediate aftermath, but two names kept resurfacing with a certain weight: a rival scientist and a disgruntled former research assistant. The rival scientist, I learned, was known for his aggressive pursuit of grant funding and academic recognition. He'd reportedly clashed with Thorne multiple times over intellectual property and research direction, especially concerning Thorne's groundbreaking, secretive project. A colleague's transcribed statement detailed a heated argument just weeks prior, where the rival scientist had allegedly threatened to expose Thorne's reckless methods if he didn't share his research. Motive: professional jealousy, fear of being overshadowed, perhaps even a desire to steal Thorne's work for himself. The stakes were high, potentially world-changing, as the initial reports on Thorne's project indicated. Then there was the former assistant. He had worked for Thorne for years before being abruptly dismissed 6 months ago. The reason for her termination was vague in the reports, irreconcilable differences, but the interviewing officer noted her palpable resentment. He had reportedly felt exploited, her contributions undervalued, and believed Thorne had taken credit for some of her early conceptual work on the very project that had now claimed his life. Her motive, revenge, or perhaps a desperate attempt to reclaim what she felt was hers. The picture was beginning to form, messy and incomplete, but undeniably taking shape. An accident? No. Not with the osmium alloy fragments, the peculiar burn patterns, and now, the crystalline residue clinging to Thorne's finger. And certainly not with the clear, simmering resentments of those closest to his work. The tension in the air was palpable, not just from the case itself, but from the implications of Thorne's research. This wasn't just about a dead scientist, it was about what he was working on, and who desperately wanted it. The meticulous eye had found its target, and the hunt was on. The whisperite found at the research facility, that microscopic trace of an unusual accelerant, not consistent with the lab's standard reagents, was now undergoing analysis. But I wasn't waiting for the chemistry report. My focus was on the digital remnants of Thorne's life. Projected across the large analytical screen before me. The lab's central server, recovered from the wreckage, was a fortress of encryption. It had taken our decryption specialists nearly a full day to crack its outer layers. Now, I was wading through Thorne's digital footprint, searching for the anomaly that mirrored the physical one. The researcher was meticulous, a colleague, hunched over a neighboring console, remarked without looking up. Every file timestamped, every access logged. The implications, I knew, were vast, global health solutions on one hand, or terrifying bioweaponry on the other. A dangerous tightrope. I drilled down into the Chimera folder. Thousands of data packets, sequence logs, simulation results. All neatly organized, until I hit a block of files dated just 3 days before Thorne's death. The naming convention shifted subtly, the file sizes were inconsistent, and the access log showed an unusual pattern, a series of rapid, high-level administrative accesses, followed by a flurry of deletions. Here, I muttered, pointing to the screen. Look at these timestamps. 3 days ago. Multiple administrative logins, all within a 5-minute window. And then, a data purge. The colleague straightened, peering at my screen. That's not Thorne's usual MO. He was obsessive about data retention. Exactly, I said, zooming in. And the deletion protocols used here. They're sophisticated. Not a simple trash on empty. This was an attempt at a deep wipe, designed to leave minimal recoverable traces. My fingers flew across the keyboard, initiating a forensic recovery scan on the affected sector. The progress bar crawled, minute by agonizing minute. The tension in the suite thickened, palpable. This wasn't just a miscalculation. This was deliberate. Someone had either accessed Thorne's system remotely, or they'd been inside the lab, using his credentials, to clean house. And Thorne himself might have been involved, trying to hide something just before his death. The idea gnawed at me. An hour later, the recovery scan finished, spitting out a partial list of file names. Many were corrupted, fragments of their former selves. But one stood out, Project Chimera, Vector Development, Phase 3. The name alone sent a chill down my spine. Vector development in genetic sequencing usually meant delivery mechanisms. Delivery of what? Healing agents, or something far more sinister? Just then, the entrance to the suite hissed open, and the lead investigator stepped in, followed by the assistant. Her name was Maya. He was Thorne's primary assistant, privy to his daily routines and, presumably, his research. "Read," the lead investigator said, gesturing towards the assistant. "She's agreed to answer a few more questions. Specifically about Thorne's recent behavior." I turned from the screen, my gaze locking onto the assistant. Her face, usually composed, was a mask of thinly veiled anxiety. "Thank you for coming in again, Maya," I said, using a calm, even tone. "I'm looking through Thorne's digital archives. We've found some unusual activity in the days leading up to the incident. Data purges, unauthorized access attempts." Her eyes flickered, a tiny muscle twitching in her jaw. He agitated. He thought he was being watched. Monitored. Watched by whom? I pressed gently. Did he name anyone? Any rival research teams? Corporations? She shook her head, her gaze dropping to the floor. No. Just them. He used to lock himself in the inner lab for hours, sometimes days. He started keeping a burner phone. Said his main line wasn't secure. She wrung her hands. He was paranoid, Reed. Truly. He even changed all his passwords, then changed them again a few days before. The accident. Did he ever mention anything specific he was working on that might warrant such paranoia? I asked. My mind racing back to Project Chimera, Vector Development, Phase 3. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a sudden, raw fear. He said he was on the verge of something that would change everything. That it was too big for one man. Too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. Her voice trembled. Did he elaborate on what wrong hands meant? She hugged herself, her gaze distant, as if reliving a horrifying memory. He just kept repeating, "They'll stop at nothing to get it." And then he'd just stare at the wall. Like he was seeing ghosts. I studied her, trying to discern truth from fear-induced exaggeration. The data manipulation, the attempted wipe, the unusual accelerant, and now the assistant's testimony about Thorne's extreme paranoia. Thorne wasn't just a victim of an accident. He was a target. And whatever he was working on, whatever it was, someone was desperate to bury it, and him, permanently. I knew I was only scratching the surface. Fluorescent lights cast a clinical glow over the stainless steel countertops and intricate analytical instruments. I leaned over a spectral analyzer, my breath fogging the cool glass of the display. The microscopic trace element, scraped from the unique burn pattern on the lab floor where Thorne's body had been found, now sat in the machine sample chamber, a minuscule speck holding the weight of the investigation. My colleague, a quiet specialist with an encyclopedic knowledge of material science, adjusted a dial with precise movements. I nodded, my eyes already tracing the jagged peaks and valleys forming on the screen. The initial scans had been inconclusive, showing a complex organic compound that didn't match anything in our standard databases of accelerants or common lab materials. That alone was a red flag. Thorne's lab was cutting edge, but not alien. This was something else entirely. Minutes crawled by, marked only by the soft whirring of the analyzer and the rhythmic click of data points registering. The tension in the suite was palpable, a quiet expectation hanging in the air. We were hunting for a ghost, a signature so subtle it had almost been consumed by the inferno. If this trace element was the killer's calling card, it was a damnably obscure one. Finally, a new set of data populated the screen. My colleague zoomed in, then cross-referenced. A faint line, barely distinguishable from the background noise, began to resolve itself into a distinct pattern. It was unique. Unmistakable. "There," he said, his voice a low exhalation. "Compare it to this." He pulled up a separate database, a highly restricted one, usually reserved for industrial espionage cases or classified materials. My gaze snapped between the two screens. The patterns aligned. Not perfectly, but close enough to trigger a match. My mind raced, trying to process the implications. "A synthetic polymer," I stated, the words tasting like metal. "A polyimide, specifically. Highly advanced, extremely heat-resistant." My colleague scrolled through the database entry. "It's a proprietary blend. Developed for high-stress, high-temperature industrial applications. Think aerospace, specialized electronics, deep-sea exploration equipment. Not something you'd find in a bioengineering lab, even one as sophisticated as Thorne's." He looked at me, his brow furrowed. "And it's rare. Very rare. Only a handful of manufacturers produce anything like this, and even fewer use this specific formulation." A cold certainty settled in my gut. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't even a simple murder. This was precision. This was a statement. The accelerant hadn't just been chosen for its destructive properties, it had been chosen for its signature. The killer wanted to leave a specific, almost untraceable mark, one that would only be found by someone looking for exactly that kind of anomaly. Omnicorp, I said, the name forming a bitter taste on my tongue. Thorne's primary corporate sponsor. They're heavily invested in advanced materials science, aren't they? Aggressive R&D, always pushing the envelope. My colleague nodded slowly. Omnicorp is listed as one of the primary developers and consumers of this specific polymer blend. They use it in their high-end industrial robotics division. The pieces clicked into place with a chilling finality. Thorne's paranoia, the data manipulation, the specific accelerant, the meticulousness of the crime scene. This wasn't a desperate act by a rival academic or a disgruntled assistant. This was corporate. And it was deeply, frighteningly professional. The investigation had just taken a sharp, dangerous turn. We weren't looking for a lone wolf anymore, we were looking for an organization. Within hours, I had arranged a meeting with Omnicorp's official liaison, a man named Mr. Finch. The corporate offices were a monument to polished steel and muted power, a stark contrast to the chaotic brilliance of Thorne's lab. Finch met me in a sterile conference room, the city sprawling silently beneath the panoramic window. He was impeccably dressed, his suit tailored to perfection, his smile a practiced, almost artificial curve. "Investigator Reed," Finch began, extending a hand that felt surprisingly soft. "A pleasure, under the circumstances. Omnicorp is, of course, devastated by Dr. Thorne's passing. A true visionary." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Finch, my investigation into Dr. Thorne's death has led me to a unique synthetic polymer. A polyimide, specifically. We've traced it to your industrial robotics division. Finch's smile didn't falter, but his eyes, a cool shade of gray, flickered almost imperceptibly. Is that so? Well, Omnicorp is a vast entity, investigator. We have many divisions, many proprietary materials. It's not uncommon for certain compounds to be utilized across various projects, perhaps even shared with our research partners. He gestured vaguely. Could be a cross-contamination, perhaps? A residue from a delivery, or a shared piece of equipment? This specific formulation is rare, Mr. and it was found in a very specific location at the scene of the incident. Not a general residue. It was part of the accelerant used in the fire. I watched him closely, noting the subtle tightening around his mouth. He was trying too hard to appear unaffected. An accelerant? Finch feigned surprise, his eyebrows rising slightly. My goodness. Are you suggesting foul play, investigator? We were led to believe it was a tragic accident. We're exploring all possibilities. But I need to understand Omnicorp's connection to this material. Did Dr. Thorne have direct access to this specific polymer? Was it used in any of his projects, even peripherally? Finch steepled his fingers, his gaze drifting to the cityscape outside. Dr. Thorne's work was highly compartmentalized, as you can imagine. Groundbreaking, sensitive. Omnicorp provided funding, resources, but his day-to-day operations were his own. We certainly wouldn't have supplied him with industrial-grade polymers for bioengineering. That would be beyond his scope. He paused, then turned back to me, his expression shifting to one of earnest cooperation. However, I want to assure you, investigator, Omnicorp will provide any and all assistance you require. Full transparency. Access to records, personnel, whatever you need. We are as eager as you are to understand the truth behind this tragedy. His eagerness felt manufactured, almost rehearsed. Too much. The overly cooperative stance, the smooth deflections, the immediate offer of unlimited access, it all felt like a carefully constructed facade. He was giving me everything I asked for, and yet, nothing at all. He confirmed Omnicorp used the polymer, denied Thorne's direct access, and then opened the floodgates of cooperation. It was a classic corporate maneuver, bury the truth in an avalanche of data, appear helpful while revealing nothing of substance. The web of connections was far more intricate than I'd initially imagined. And Omnicorp, with its polished surfaces and evasive liaison, was at its very center. I leaned closer to the monitor, the digital readout scrolling in a relentless cascade of data. Days bled into nights, fueled by stale coffee and a singular obsession, the microscopic polymer fragments retrieved from Thorne's lab. They were unique, unlike anything cataloged in our extensive databases. Their composition, a complex blend of known compounds with an unusual binding agent, pointed to a custom synthesis. Someone had engineered this. My fingers danced across the keyboard, adjusting parameters, cross-referencing spectral patterns. Each minor alteration in the polymer's structure, each unusual isotopic signature, was a breadcrumb leading away from the official narrative of a tragic accident. The burn patterns, the way the material had fragmented, it was all too precise, too controlled for a random explosion. This wasn't a lab mishap, it was a delivery mechanism, designed to create chaos while concealing its true purpose. A faint, almost imperceptible peak emerged on the gas chromatograph, a signature I hadn't seen before. It was a rare earth element, used in specialized industrial applications, particularly in advanced ceramics and some high-performance coatings. Its presence in the polymer was a revelation, narrowing the field of potential manufacturers dramatically. This wasn't some backyard concoction, it required sophisticated equipment and specific sourcing. I had a direction, a thread to pull. A jolt of adrenaline snapped through me. This was it. This was the first real lead that wasn't circumstantial. I printed the report, the stark black and white data feeling like a victory flag. The next step was to trace this specific component back through its supply chain. My mind was still buzzing with the data, the possibilities. I walked toward my vehicle, the crisp night air doing little to clear the mental fog. As I stepped off the curb, a sudden roar shattered the quiet. A delivery truck, its headlights blinding, swerved sharply from the adjacent lane. The driver's side mirror clipped my shoulder, sending a searing shockwave through my arm as I stumbled back onto the pavement. The truck didn't slow, its taillights receding into the distance with an unnerving haste. I sat there for a moment, the throbbing pain in my arm a stark counterpoint to the sudden chill that gripped me. My breath hitched. It wasn't just a close call. The truck had veered across a solid white line, directly into my path, then accelerated away without a glance. My mind replayed the moment, the deliberate swerve, the sheer indifference. It felt less like an accident and more like a warning shot, precisely aimed. Someone knew I was getting too close. I wasn't just investigating a murder, I was being investigated. Everything seemed normal. The stacks of files, the half-empty coffee mug, the worn leather chair. But as I moved to my desk, my gaze fell on a small, antique compass, a gift from my father. I always kept it aligned precisely north, a small personal ritual. Now, it was rotated a few degrees east. Barely perceptible. Anyone else would have missed it. But I didn't miss details. Not ever. This wasn't a random search. This was a message, delivered with surgical precision. Someone had been in my space, someone who knew me well enough to know what subtle disruption would register. They hadn't taken anything obvious, hadn't left a mess. They just wanted me to know they'd been there. They wanted me to know I was vulnerable. It was an unknown number. It was Maya, Thorne's assistant. Maya? What's wrong? I asked, my voice low. I have to tell you something, she stammered, her breathing shallow. I saw things before he died. I was too scared to say anything, but now. After what happened to you. I saw it on the news, the truck, they said it was an accident. My grip tightened on the phone. What did you see, Maya? Someone was in the lab, after hours. Not Thorne, not the security guard. Someone else. Her voice broke, a raw, ragged sound. Several times. Always late, always after everyone else had left. Tall, broad shoulders. I thought it was just a contractor, or maybe even Thorne himself, working on something secret. He was always secretive, you know, but then. But I remember the way they moved. Quick, purposeful. And once, I heard a faint, metallic clink from inside his private research area. Like something being connected, or disconnected. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it wasn't my business. The metallic clink. The purposeful movements. It all clicked into place, dovetailing with my growing suspicions. The polymer, the staged accident, the breach in my office. Maya's fear was palpable, a live wire humming through the phone line. The killer wasn't just intimately familiar with Thorne's work, they were intimately familiar with his lab, his schedule, and perhaps even Maya's own habits. The net was closing in, and I was squarely in its path. My gaze drifted from the chemical breakdown to the adjacent screen, where a meticulously reconstructed digital model of Thorne's high-security lab spun slowly. Every piece of equipment, every air vent, every sensor node was mapped. Beneath it, a terminal displayed an endless stream of log files, environmental controls, access records, equipment activation timestamps. The sheer volume was staggering, designed to obscure, to overwhelm. But I wasn't looking for a smoking gun, I was hunting for a whisper, a momentary tremor in the system that shouldn't have been there. Hours dissolved. My eyes burned, but the determination in my gut only intensified. I cross-referenced the mass spectrometer's findings with the lab's atmospheric composition logs. There it was, subtle enough to be dismissed as sensor drift, but persistent. A fractional dip in oxygen levels, followed by a barely perceptible spike in nitrogen, minutes before the incident. It wasn't enough to suffocate, not even enough to cause discomfort, but it was there. A deliberate, controlled venting, I realized, not a malfunction. Someone had been meticulously purging and enriching the air. This was where the real complexity lay. The device was bespoke, built to his exacting specifications, its operational parameters known only to him and, presumably, his closest collaborators. I filtered the data, looking for any deviation from Thorne's documented research protocols. His digital notes, recovered from a secured server, laid out his precise methodologies. Every temperature curve, every pressure gradient, every energy output level was detailed. And there it was. A sequence of commands, initiated remotely, overriding a safety shutoff protocol. Not a direct activation of the device, which would have been too obvious, but a subtle alteration of its internal conditions. A ghost in the machine. Stage 1, the atmospheric manipulation. The inert gas, detected by the mass spectrometer, wasn't just a random contaminant. It was a catalyst, designed to prime the environment. Stage 2, the specific, remotely triggered command. It wasn't a direct activation of Thorne's primary research function, but a subtle adjustment to the device's internal pressure regulators, causing a minor, controlled leak of a highly volatile compound. This compound, released into the primed, altered atmosphere, would have reacted instantly, not explosively, but with a rapid, intense thermal burst, a flash fire, contained within the immediate vicinity of the apparatus. The burn patterns at the scene, which had initially perplexed me, suddenly made terrifying sense. Not an uncontrolled explosion, but a focused, intense thermal event, designed to appear as a system overload, a tragic miscalculation. The lab's automated suppression systems would have kicked in immediately, dousing the flames, washing away much of the evidence, leaving behind only the subtle traces I had found. It was a perfectly orchestrated illusion of an accident. The precision was chilling. This was an assassin with an intimate understanding of Thorne's genius, his specific research, the very vulnerabilities of his bespoke equipment. They hadn't just known the lab, they had known Thorne's mind, anticipating his protocols, understanding how to weaponize his own work against him. The perpetrator hadn't just killed Thorne, they had meticulously engineered his death to look like a consequence of his own groundbreaking work, burying the truth under layers of simulated technical failure. The tension in the suite was palpable, a silent hum of recognition. The identity of the killer remained elusive, but their signature was now emblazoned across the digital landscape of Thorne's final moments. This wasn't about a rival with a grudge. This was about someone who had mastered the art of invisible murder, someone who could read Thorne's schematics as easily as their own thoughts. And that, I realized, was far more dangerous. My next move had to be equally precise. It was a polymer, highly reactive, designed to degrade almost instantly upon exposure to heat, yet it hadn't completely vanished. A few scattered molecules, tenacious in their survival, told a story. This wasn't just about a tragic miscalculation or a desperate act. An accident wouldn't be so meticulously staged to erase specific evidence while leaving just enough chaos to suggest an explosion. Suicide didn't leave behind a signature like this, a ghost of a complex mechanism designed to conceal. My initial hypothesis, that the killer was after Thorne's groundbreaking research, felt too simplistic now. Theft could have been achieved with far less theatricality, far less risk. The sheer complexity of the method suggested a motive beyond mere acquisition. This killer didn't just want Thorne's work, they wanted to bury it, to ensure it never saw the light of day. They wanted Thorne silenced, and everything he represented erased. Still at it, Reed? The voice belonged to a senior analyst, a man who preferred the comfort of his ergonomic chair to the harsh glare of the monitors. He stood by the coffee machine, nursing a steaming mug. Still at it, I confirmed, not looking away from the spectral analysis. This polymer. It's not standard lab equipment. And it was applied with surgical precision. So, not an accident, then. It wasn't a question. The analyst had seen enough of my cases to know where I was heading. No. It was designed to look like one. To disintegrate, taking the real cause with it. But it wasn't perfect. I zoomed in on a particularly jagged peak in the data. Whoever did this wanted Thorne's research gone, but more than that, they wanted his voice gone. The idea solidified in my mind. If the goal was to prevent public release or completion, what was Thorne on the verge of revealing? I remembered the heavily encrypted files on his main server, the ones that were ostensibly just backups of his research. Everyone assumed they were just redundant copies, perhaps secured against corporate espionage. But what if they contained something more? Something Thorne knew was dangerous, something he wanted to protect from the wrong hands, or perhaps, expose to the right ones. I needed to re-examine Thorne's entire digital footprint, not just for the research itself, but for anything that pointed to his state of mind, his ethical dilemmas. I pulled up the directory structure of Thorne's recovered hard drives. Most of it was neatly categorized, standard project files. But there, tucked away in a subdirectory labeled legacy_archive_do not touch, was a single, heavily encrypted folder. It wasn't linked to any project, wasn't referenced in any of his accessible notes. It was an anomaly, screaming for attention. I need assistance with a deep-level decryption, I called out to a colleague in the adjacent bay, a woman with quick fingers and an even quicker mind for digital forensics. Thorne's system. There's a folder. It feels different. She walked over, her eyes scanning the screen. Legacy_archive? That's a new one. The silence in the suite, usually punctuated by the gentle whir of machinery, felt heavy with anticipation. The clock on the wall ticked, each second, amplifying the tension. Hours blurred. The colleague worked tirelessly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then, a soft chime. "Got it," she murmured, a note of surprise in her voice. "This isn't just a password. This is layered. Custom encryption. Someone didn't want this found." The folder unzipped, revealing a series of dated logs, not scientific data, but what looked like personal entries, time-stamped over the last year. I opened the most recent one first. Thorne's precise, academic prose was instantly recognizable, but laced with an urgency I hadn't seen in his formal papers. Entry October 15, 23, the implications of Project Chimera are becoming horrifyingly clear. Omnicorp's funding of the Defensive Applications Division is a smokescreen. My original work was for societal benefit, for true advancement. What they are doing with the derived protocols? It's a weapon. Not merely destructive, but insidious. Project Chimera. A name I'd heard whispered in academic circles, always associated with Thorne's initial research, but dismissed as a speculative offshoot. Now, it was real and dangerous. I scrolled down, my eyes devouring the text. Entry October 22, 23. My attempts to raise ethical concerns internally have been met with polite dismissal, then thinly veiled threats. They believe I am indispensable, but I am not blind. They intend to push this project to completion, regardless of the catastrophic consequences. I cannot allow this to happen. I have begun compiling a comprehensive dossier. The world needs to know what Omnicorp is truly funding, what Thorne's genius has inadvertently unleashed. Entry November 1, 23. I am making preparations. The full scope of Project Chimera, its clandestine funding by Omnicorp, and their intent to weaponize my discoveries must be exposed. I will present this information to the regulatory bodies, to the press, to anyone who will listen. The risk is immense, but the alternative is unthinkable. They will try to stop me. I know this. The logs ended there, just days before his death. The killer hadn't just wanted Thorne's work, they wanted to prevent its completion, prevent its public release, and bury the truth of Project Chimera with Thorne himself. The stakes had just escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. This wasn't just murder, it was an act of corporate espionage and suppression, with global implications. And I was standing in the middle of it. The implications settled heavy in my gut, twisting the initial findings into a grotesque, deliberate act. My gaze lingered on the final entry of the data log, a stark black mark against the bright white screen. I took a deep breath, the sterile scent of the suite doing little to calm the sudden prickle of adrenaline. My task had shifted from merely understanding a crime scene to uncovering a conspiracy. The initial focus on the mechanics of the sabotage now broadened to encompass its architects. The sheer volume of data was daunting, but I thrived on the minutiae. I filtered the logs to the critical window, the 3 days leading up to Thorne's death, and the immediate aftermath. Then, I cross-referenced this with the facility's internal surveillance footage, a painstaking process of matching timestamps and faces to names. The system was robust, designed to track even the most fleeting presence. Omnicorp, Thorne's employer had granted a select few individuals top-tier access to the research lab, beyond the standard administrative staff. These were the project managers, the lead engineers, and crucially, the corporate liaisons. The list was still too long, a dozen names staring back at me from the primary monitor. The sabotage itself was a masterpiece of misdirection. It required not just access, but a profound understanding of quantum-level energy manipulation and the specific calibration of Thorne's experimental apparatus. It wasn't merely about flipping a switch, it was about subtly altering parameters, creating a cascade failure that mimicked an unfortunate accident. This wasn't a job for just any engineer. This was for someone intimately familiar with the theoretical underpinnings and practical execution of Thorne's research. I began to overlay expertise requirements onto the access list. Who possessed the specific, niche knowledge to pull off such a sophisticated act? I sifted through academic backgrounds, prior project involvement, even patents filed by the individuals on the list. Many had impressive resumes, but one name consistently surfaced with a unique blend of qualifications: the Omnicorp liaison, a professional known simply as the liaison. I clicked on the liaison's profile, a standard corporate summary appearing on my screen. David Thorne. No relation to Aris, the file stated clearly, a common enough coincidence. His role was to facilitate communication and resource allocation between Omnicorp's corporate structure and Aris Thorne's independent research. On the surface, it seemed innocuous, a bureaucratic necessity. But then I scrolled further. Beneath the polished corporate details, a more intriguing history began to emerge. His professional journey wasn't a linear ascent through corporate ranks. There were gaps, periods of employment vaguely described as special projects or consulting roles for government-adjacent entities. My eyebrows furrowed. This wasn't typical for a corporate liaison. I dug deeper, accessing a more restricted database, one that required my highest clearance. The new information flashed across my screen, stark and undeniable. The pieces began to click into place with an unnerving precision. Covert operations. Industrial espionage. And then, the final, damning connection. A red flag, triggered by a keyword search I'd embedded in my system, flared on my secondary monitor. A decade ago, a major scandal had rocked the tech world, the theft of intellectual property related to advanced energy systems from a rival corporation. The case had been messy, inconclusive, ultimately blamed on an anonymous international collective. But the liaison's name, David Thorne, was briefly mentioned in a heavily redacted internal memo, a peripheral figure in the intelligence-gathering phase of that investigation. My breath hitched. The link was tenuous, buried deep in archives, but it was there. A professional history of covert operations, a past connection to intellectual property theft, and now, positioned as the direct liaison to Aris Thorne, a man on the verge of exposing a corporate secret related to world-changing technology. The motive, the means, the opportunity, it all converged on one individual. The inside man. The game had just gotten far more dangerous. The liaison's corporate summary still glowed on my screen, a sterile portrait of ambition and calculated neutrality. David Thorne. No relation to Aris, the file insisted. I knew better. My gut tightened, a familiar knot of certainty forming. The air hummed with the low thrum of the building's ventilation, a constant companion to my late nights. my gaze drifted to the evidence board, a spider web of timelines, photographs, and chemical analyses. The unique polymer residue, a signature I'd found at Aris Thorne's lab, had also surfaced in the debris from the 2 accidents I'd narrowly avoided. Not random events. Targeted. The liaison had tried to silence me, just as he had silenced Aris. The time for subtlety was over. I needed to flush him out. I devised the trap, a digital ghost. I drafted a preliminary report, carefully crafting a false lead. The report detailed a breakthrough in Aris Thorne's research, a supposed discovery of a highly stable, self-replicating energy matrix within his final project. It was specific enough to sound plausible to anyone familiar with Aris's theoretical work, but utterly meaningless to anyone outside the inner circle. Crucially, it hinted at a potential application that would be catastrophic if misused, a detail only the killer, tasked with suppressing the truth, would understand the full significance of. I routed the report through a secure, but intentionally vulnerable, internal server, ensuring it would appear as an accidental leak, accessible to anyone with sufficient clearance and an inclination to snoop. The liaison, with his facilitator role, had both. I watched the clock, the seconds ticking like a metronome against the quiet hum of the server racks down the hall. My preparations for the confrontation were meticulous. It was a controlled environment, equipped with comprehensive surveillance systems, every angle covered. I made sure the specific samples containing the trace polymer, the ones linking the liaison to my own near misses and Aris Thorne's demise, were prominently displayed, awaiting further analysis. It was bait, carefully laid. I waited. The silence in the suite was profound, broken only by the software of the air filtration system and the rhythmic blink of indicator lights on the analytical instruments. My own breathing felt unnaturally loud. My fingers traced the cool steel of the examination table. The tension was a palpable weight on my shoulders, a coiled spring ready to release. Just after midnight, the outer door to the suite hissed open. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed on the polished concrete floor. A figure moved into the main examination area, silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting. It was the liaison. He moved with a quiet urgency, his eyes scanning the tables. He went straight for the labeled trays containing the polymer samples. His movements were precise, practiced. He wasn't just looking, he was assessing, planning. I saw him reach for a small, specialized tool from his pocket, a device clearly designed for data manipulation or sample alteration. He froze, his hand hovering over the samples. His head snapped towards me, eyes wide with a flicker of panic before a mask of corporate composure slid back into place. Read. Just. Reviewing the late-stage findings. My role, as you know, is to ensure all resources are properly allocated for investigation. His voice was smooth. Or providing you with a data scrambler. He dropped the tool, a faint metallic clink against the table. A misunderstanding. A proprietary blend, used only in specific, high-security Omnicorp projects. We found it in Aris Thorne's lab, coating the ruptured conduits. And we found it in the debris from the 2 accidents that nearly claimed my life. His face paled, the corporate veneer cracking. He swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The camera's small red eyes watched his every move. You knew about Aris Thorne's true research, didn't you? I pressed, my voice low and steady. Not just the energy matrix I leaked in my fabricated report, but the actual bioweapon component he was developing. The one he threatened to expose. His shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of him. He had developed a highly potent, targeted cellular disruptor. Too dangerous. OmniCorp couldn't risk it getting out. They tasked you to neutralize him? He nodded, a single, jerky movement. He made it clear he wouldn't comply. He was too principled. They gave me the order. Make it look like an accident. And when you started digging too deep, asking too many questions, I had to ensure you didn't connect the dots. The polymer was a mistake. A residue from the suppression agent used in the lab, and then the truth, finally unveiled, was far more sinister than a simple corporate rivalry. And I had nearly shared his fate. The confession had settled in the room like a layer of fine, toxic dust. I watched the younger man, David Thorne, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. The weight of his words, of the truth they carried, pressed down on us all. OmniCorp, the monolithic entity that had funded Aris's brilliance, had orchestrated his demise, not out of rivalry, but out of a chilling, self-serving protection of something darker still. The apprehension of David Thorne was swift, almost anticlimactic after the raw emotion of his admission. He offered no resistance, no further pleas or denials. The federal agents moved in, their movements practiced and efficient, cuffing him with a quiet click that echoed the finality of his situation. I watched him being led away, his face pale and etched with a weariness that went beyond mere fatigue. He was a man who had carried a terrible secret, and now, finally unburdened, he looked utterly broken. My job, however, was far from over. The confession was merely the first domino. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on my workstation, illuminating the digital files splayed across multiple monitors. I pulled up a magnified image of the unusual burn pattern I had observed on the lab's primary control panel. At the time, it seemed like a secondary effect of the thermal runaway. Now, with OmniCorp's complicity laid bare, I could interpret the minute scorch marks, the precisely melted circuitry. It wasn't a spontaneous failure, it was a targeted overload, designed to mimic a systemic collapse. Someone had engineered that accident with surgical precision, leveraging Aris's own innovative materials against him. The unraveling of the OmniCorp conspiracy was swift and brutal once the floodgates opened. David Thorne's testimony, combined with the irrefutable digital and forensic evidence we had amassed, ripped through the corporation's carefully constructed facade. High-profile arrests followed in quick succession. The chief operating officer, a man whose public image was one of unwavering integrity, was taken into custody from his penthouse apartment. Several senior research directors, their names once synonymous with scientific progress, faced similar fates. The sheer scale of the deception, the calculated risk management that deemed a brilliant mind expendable, was staggering. The media firestorm that erupted was unlike anything I had witnessed in my career. Every major news outlet ran with the story, their headlines screaming about corporate malfeasance, scientific ethics, and the cold-blooded murder of a genius. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls from internal affairs, federal prosecutors, and an endless stream of reporters fishing for details. I kept my focus on the data, the facts, the evidence. Now, his name was a tragic symbol of ambition corrupted. I found myself increasingly drawn into the ethical debate that exploded in the wake of the scandal. colleagues murmured about the implications, about the dangerous precedent set when profit superseded human life and scientific integrity. "What does this mean for future breakthroughs?" one of the bureau analysts mused aloud, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. "Who controls what gets discovered? What gets suppressed?" These were questions that gnawed at me, questions I had no answers for. My job was to find the truth of what happened, not to legislate morality, yet the two were inextricably linked. And then there was Aris Thorne's research. The true prize. The reason for the conspiracy. With Omnicorp's leadership in disarray, a vacuum formed, and the battle for control of his groundbreaking work began. Governments, their intelligence agencies now fully aware of the revolutionary potential Aris had unlocked, started circling. International organizations issued urgent statements, emphasizing the need for global oversight. The research, once locked away in a high-security lab, was now a geopolitical hot potato, its future uncertain, its power coveted by all. I knew my part in this chapter was drawing to a close, but the wider story, the story of Aris Thorne's legacy and the fight for its control, was just beginning. The tension in the air was thick, a pervasive hum of anticipation and fear. The case was solved, but the consequences, I realized, would ripple across the world for years to come. I sat at a stainless steel workbench, illuminated by the unforgiving glare of overhead fluorescent lights, a stack of case files neatly squared before me. The scent of sterile cleaning agents and the faint, metallic tang of processed evidence clung to the air, a familiar perfume of truth. The suite, usually a hive of quiet activity, felt unusually still in the late evening, a perfect echo of the quiet disquiet that had taken root within me. The final reports on Aris Thorne's demise were complete, signed, and filed. David Thorne, the protege, the nephew, had confessed to it all. He had not wanted his uncle's research, the Phage project, to fall into the wrong hands. A desperate attempt to contain a genie already out of its bottle, or perhaps, a covetous grab for control under the guise of moral purity. The line had blurred, as it always did, when ambition and fear intertwined. I picked up a polished fragment of the reaction chamber, now just a piece of mangled ceramic, turning it over in my gloved fingers. It was cool, smooth, utterly inert now, but I could still feel the phantom heat of the destructive force that had torn through Aris Thorne's advanced facility. My mind replayed the scene, the controlled chaos, the precise placement of the secondary explosive device, the calculated timing. It wasn't a sudden outburst of rage, it was a cold, deliberate excision. He hadn't killed for greed, not directly, but for control over knowledge he deemed too dangerous for the world, or perhaps, too dangerous for anyone but him to wield. The case had left a mark, a deeper impression than most. I'd seen the ugliness of humanity countless times, the raw violence, the petty jealousies that festered into murder. But this was different. Aris Thorne had pushed boundaries, creating something truly revolutionary, something with the potential to reshape life itself. And in doing so, he had invited a predator who believed themselves the ultimate arbiter of progress. The personal toll was a quiet companion these days. Sleep came in fitful snatches, punctuated by phantom flashes of the lab's wreckage, the spectral image of Thorne's meticulously organized chaos. I'd spent countless hours sifting through the detritus of a genius's final moments, piecing together a narrative of betrayal from molecular residues and energy signatures. It was a burden I chose, a responsibility to those who could no longer speak for themselves, but it was a burden nonetheless. Only the dates remained, stark black against the beige. It felt resolved, yet not truly settled. The killer was apprehended, justice served in the most immediate sense. But the larger questions, the ones about scientific responsibility, about the gatekeepers of innovation, those lingered like the faint ozone smell after a storm. What would happen to the phage project now? Would it be locked away, destroyed, or would another brilliant, ambitious mind inevitably pick up its threads, driven by the same insatiable curiosity and the same perilous disregard for consequence? A colleague, a senior investigator from the next bay, passed by, his footsteps echoing softly. He paused at my doorway, holding a thick manila envelope. "Read," he said, his voice low, "this just came in. From the Capital Division. Looks like another big one." He placed the envelope on my workbench. It was heavy, sealed with official wax. I didn't open it immediately. My fingers traced the rough texture of the paper, feeling the familiar anticipation, the subtle tension that always preceded the unknown. The world kept turning, and with it, new mysteries arose, new challenges to the fragile order we sought to maintain. Thorne's case was closed, a grim chapter filed away, but the ongoing struggle between progress and peril, between truth and its deliberate obfuscation, continued. I took a deep breath, the scent of sterile chemicals filling my lungs. My commitment remained absolute. I was ready.